I still remember that evening as if it were carved into my memory. The living room was crowded, the air thick with laughter, the kind that stings when you realize it's not shared with you, it's directed at you. My uncles, aunts, cousins, even some neighbors who had dropped by, all gathered comfortably in the warmth of my parents' home. They had food in their hands, stories on their lips, and I had one fragile dream in mind. I had just spoken aloud what I had been rehearsing silently for months. I want to start something of my own. I don't want to spend my life working paycheck to paycheck. I want to build something, become financially independent. The words barely left my mouth before the laughter began. Not the kind of chuckle that shows encouragement, but the kind that burns. My uncle leaned back in his chair, slapped his knee and said, "You, independent, you can't even manage to keep a stable job." My cousin added with a grin, "Dreams are free, but reality costs money. You'll never be rich. Better stick to helping around here." And then came the comment that crushed me the most. My own father, standing there among relatives and neighbors, shook his head and muttered, "Sit in the corner. Don't embarrass yourself with these ideas." The room erupted again, louder this time. Their words weren't just noise, they were daggers. Every laugh carried the same message: you are not enough, you will never be enough. I didn't argue back, I didn't shout or defend myself. My silence looked like surrender to them. Maybe that's why they laughed even harder, because silence to them meant defeat. But inside me something shifted. Their mockery wasn't the end of my dream, it was the beginning of my vow. In that moment, while their eyes sparkled with ridicule, mine burned with resolve. I looked around the room, at every smirk, every dismissive shake of the head, and quietly promised myself, one day the same people who told me to sit in the corner will see me at the head of the table. One day this humiliation will be the story I tell, not the reality I live. It was a contrast that no one else could see at the time, my public humiliation versus my private vow. They thought they had silenced me. In truth, they had awakened me. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Their laughter echoed in my head over and over as if it wanted to break me. But instead of breaking, I started building, in my mind first, in my spirit next. I pictured myself years from now, walking into a room not as the boy they mocked, but as the man they underestimated. I said nothing then, but deep inside I knew the truth. Their words had already written the first page of my story. And I was determined to write the rest myself. For years, I carried the weight of my family on my back. Long before they laughed at my dreams, I had already sacrificed more than they ever knew. I worked double shifts, took odd jobs, and skipped opportunities that could have brought me closer to my own goals, all because they needed me. When the rent was late, it was my paycheck that bridged the gap. When the fridge was empty, it was my hands that bagged groceries after working 12-hour days. And when the electricity bill threatened to plunge the house into darkness, it was me who quietly slid the money across the table. I never asked for thanks, I never demanded recognition. In my mind, that's what family did, we showed up for each other. My goals could wait, I thought. My dreams could sit on the shelf for a while. After all, what good was personal success if the people I loved were drowning? But here's the bitter irony, the more I gave, the less they respected me. My loyalty became invisible, my sacrifices turned into expectations. What I offered out of love, they began to treat as obligation. And eventually, they dismissed me as a failure, as though my constant support meant nothing. I remember one particular moment. My cousin wanted to go back to school but didn't have the tuition. I covered part of it quietly without making it a big deal. Years later, when he graduated, he spoke proudly about his self-made journey while mocking me for never finishing anything. I sat there smiling, clapping, even while his words felt like knives. He had no idea, or maybe he did and simply didn't care, that I had made his dream possible by burying mine. That was the price of belonging, sacrificing my own identity to keep the family afloat. And still, they looked at me as if I were the weak one. Let me pause here for a moment. Quick pause, tell me, where are you listening from right now? I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments below, because every place has its own story of sacrifice and belonging, and maybe yours will sound a lot like mine. Back to my story. Over the years, I had grown used to swallowing my pride. I told myself it didn't matter if they didn't see me. I told myself that dignity could wait, that recognition wasn't important. But the truth is, deep down, I longed for something more. Not wealth, not luxury, just acknowledgement. Just a simple moment where someone said, "We see what you've done, we value your sacrifice." But instead, they turned me into the family punchline. To them, I was the one who never made it, the one who was always struggling. They didn't see the silent hours I put in, the nights I came home exhausted, the paychecks that vanished before I could even think about myself. And so, when they laughed at me in that living room, it wasn't just about the words. It wasn't just about them mocking my dream of financial independence. It was about every invisible sacrifice I had ever made crashing down at once. It was about dignity. Because money can be earned and lost, but dignity, once that's taken, once it's laughed at, it carves something deep inside you. That's why the stakes became so high for me. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about reclaiming the dignity they had stripped from me in front of others. It was about showing that loyalty given should never be repaid with betrayal. And as much as it hurt, that betrayal became the fuel I didn't know I needed. It happened during another family gathering, the kind of event that should have been filled with warmth, stories, and the comfort of being among your own blood. Instead, it became the night that changed everything. Relatives filled the house and neighbors had been invited too. The living room buzzed with chatter, plates clattered in the kitchen, and laughter bounced from wall to wall. I tried to blend in quietly, helping set up chairs, pouring drinks, making sure everyone felt at home. But somehow, as it often did, the conversation turned toward money. Who was doing well, who was struggling, who was making something of themselves. And then it happened. One of my cousins smirked and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least I'm not still dreaming about getting rich like some people here." Heads turned, a few chuckles rippled through the room. My aunt, always eager to join in, added, "Don't talk about that nonsense. He's been chasing ideas for years and still has nothing to show for it." I felt the heat rising in my face. I tried to swallow it, but then my father, the man whose approval I once craved, shook his head and muttered in front of the entire group, "He'll never learn. Some people are just meant to stay at the bottom." The room erupted in laughter again. Even the neighbors, people who barely knew me, smiled as if I were a walking joke. That was the moment the line was crossed. Because it's one thing to be criticized in private. It's another to be humiliated in front of outsiders, to be stripped of dignity while others watch and nod in agreement. I didn't argue back, I didn't raise my voice, didn't slam a fist on the table, I stayed silent. To them, that silence looked like shame, like I had no defense. They thought they had won the battle by breaking me down in front of others. But they were wrong. My silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Behind that silence, a storm was building. While they mocked me, I was already making a decision. That night, I vowed to act. I vowed that this would not be the story of my life, that their laughter would not be the last chapter. I looked around the room and studied their faces. They didn't notice me, not really. To them, I was already invisible, already defeated. But in that invisibility, I found something powerful. I realized that the less they saw me, the easier it would be to move in ways they would never expect. The vow I made wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost whispered in my own mind. "You'll see, one day you'll all see." And that's where the story begins to turn. Because the real question is this: what does a vow look like when it's carried through? What happens when someone takes years of humiliation and transforms it into a plan? That night, while their laughter still echoed in the hallways, I knew the answer was already unfolding. After that night, I stopped wasting energy replaying their laughter. Instead, I began paying attention, closer than ever before. If they wanted to label me a failure, I decided I would become the kind of failure who listens, who observes, who learns where the cracks truly lie. And the cracks, as it turned out, weren't in me, they were in them. Through casual conversations, little slips during family dinners, and whispers from neighbors who loved to gossip, I began piecing together the truth. Beneath their arrogant confidence, several members of my family were drowning, not in water, but in debt. An uncle whose booming voice always led the room had missed multiple mortgage payments. A cousin, the same one who once mocked me for never finishing anything, was behind on his car loan. Even my father, the man who told me I'd never rise above the bottom, was quietly juggling overdue bills just to keep the lights on. On the surface, they looked untouchable, but numbers don't lie. At first, I didn't know what to do with this information. I wasn't a banker, I wasn't a lawyer. I was just the one they called the dreamer with nothing to his name. But then I stumbled onto something that changed everything. In a late-night rabbit hole of research, I discovered that debt isn't just a private shame. It's a tradable asset. Mortgages, loans, credit agreements. If someone owes money, those obligations can be sold, transferred, or even purchased by someone else. Legally, quietly. I remember sitting there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. Could it really be that simple? Could the same people who laughed at me find themselves answering to me without even realizing it? The thought wasn't born out of greed. It wasn't even about revenge, at least not at first. It was about leverage, about dignity, about finally holding a card in a game where I had always been dealt none. I began making discreet inquiries. Not loud, not obvious, just careful steps. I learned where filings were made, how debt portfolios were managed, and how ownership of debt could be transferred. The more I studied, the more it felt like I had stumbled upon a hidden world, one they never expected me to enter. It was surreal, walking past family members who boasted of their stability, who still saw me as the dreamer in the corner, while I quietly gathered evidence that their foundation was crumbling. They were arrogant, yes, but arrogance is blind. And I was done being blind. One by one, their vulnerabilities revealed themselves, written not in gossip or insults, but in numbers that don't lie. I didn't act right away. I waited, I researched. I tested the waters with small conversations in financial offices just to understand the process better. I was patient, methodical, almost surgical. Because if I was going to move, I wanted to make sure every step was lawful, deliberate, and undeniable. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who mocked me for dreaming too big had built their lives on fragile ground. And I, the so-called failure, had found the very ground they stood on and learned how to own it. I didn't celebrate, not yet. There was nothing to celebrate. Not until the plan was real, not until the ink on the papers was mine. But that night, as I closed my laptop and lay back in bed, I whispered to myself the same words I had the night of their laughter. One day, you'll all see. Only now, that day didn't feel like a distant fantasy. It felt close. The first purchase felt like a test, part nerve, part proof. I had spent weeks learning the language of debt, where filings lived, how servicers handled portfolios, what kinds of notices were routine and which ones raised red flags. I moved quietly, like someone threading a needle in the dark, because if I made noise now, they'd see me coming. I found a small package of accounts tied to a local collection agency, nothing dramatic on paper, just several overdue installments rolled together. One of those accounts belonged to my cousin, the same cousin who once crowed about being self-made while calling me a fool. The documents were dry and procedural, but on them sat an opportunity I couldn't ignore. I engaged a legitimate broker, walked through the contracts, and completed the transaction the way any investor would, no theatrics, no threats, only ink and signatures and the quiet hum of legality. When the transfer was recorded, the balance didn't change for my cousin, nothing in the house collapsed in an instant. But a new name now controlled that obligation. A company I had formed months earlier, an LLC set up to hold assets. On paper, the creditor had shifted. A week later, a polite letter arrived in my cousin's mailbox. It didn't bear my handwriting. It didn't carry my face or my voice. It came from the collection agency under the new name, formal, respectful, and oddly clinical. Please find enclosed your account statement and updated payment options, it read. I watched from a distance as confusion rippled through family conversations. He called his brother, then his mother, then my aunt. His tone varied between irritation and embarrassment. Who even buys this stuff? He asked over the phone, bewildered and a little panicked. He didn't suspect me. He didn't even imagine that the person he'd mocked so casually could be the one setting the terms now. The contrast between their laughter months ago and the uneasy silence now was almost cinematic. Those same voices that once boomed with certainty faltered when confronted with paperwork that suggested someone else, someone with legal standing, was quietly in control. Pride has a way of silencing you when the ledger contradicts your story. I didn't gloat, I stayed quiet. I didn't send taunting messages or stage an elaborate reveal. The power of that moment was in its silence. It was in the fact that the rules had changed without a shout. They were still the same people who had mocked me, but now the script that governed their daily lives had an author they hadn't expected. And because this was not a revenge fantasy written for catharsis, I kept things professional. The notices I sent were factual and humane payment plans, options for restructuring, ways to avoid escalation. I made sure the first correspondence was never inflammatory. I wanted leverage, not ruin. I wanted recognition, not cruelty. Still, when my cousin showed the letter at the next small family gathering, you could see the shift. He read the polite language aloud, then glanced up at the group, searching faces for answers. Some shrugged, others looked away. My father, who had once told me to sit in the corner, cleared his throat and changed the subject. The laughter that had filled the room before was gone, replaced by a brittle pause. Right here, if you're watching this and the story is resonating, pause for a second. If you've ever been dismissed by people you love, give this video a like and subscribe. It helps me keep telling stories like this, and it reminds me that none of us are truly alone when rebuilding dignity. After that first purchase, something else shifted besides their comfort. I felt a strange blend of vindication and responsibility. Holding the paper meant choices had to be made wisely. I could have pushed hardest, demanded harsh penalties, and made an example out of someone who had embarrassed me in front of the neighborhood. But the person I wanted to become wasn't a mirror of their cruelty. So I kept my head down and continued to learn the rules of the game. I watched how payment plans were negotiated, how forbearance kept families afloat, and how a compassionate approach could be both effective and humane. The unease at family gatherings was real, but it was also a mirror showing them the consequences of their previous behavior without theatrics. The first quiet purchase proved two things. Their laughter had been built on shaky ground, and I had the patience and clarity to turn that ground into leverage without losing myself. The ledger recorded more than debt, it recorded a new balance of power. And with that balance came a responsibility to decide what kind of person I would be when the final accounting came due. After the quiet success of that first purchase, I realized this wasn't a fluke or a one-off. The mechanics worked. The law bent in predictable ways. The trick was no longer whether I could do it, it was how far I was willing to go. I threw myself into learning everything I could about the architecture of debt, mortgage-backed securities, note transfers, loan servicers, the little clauses that made big differences. I spoke to attorneys, to brokers, to accountants, people who treated obligations like inventory. I kept everything above board. Every LLC, every contract, every wire transfer was pristine. If anyone ever questioned the legitimacy, there would be no hole to poke through. With each new piece of knowledge, my options multiplied. It started with small consumer accounts, then grew to auto loans, and eventually I found openings in commercial portfolios. I bid on a package that contained a few small business loans, one of which tied back to a cousin who ran a neighborhood shop. I bought a note on a vehicle used by another relative. And then, quietly, I purchased a partial interest in a mortgage that had once been the source of loud bragging over family dinners. Each acquisition increased my personal risk. I was pouring money I had scraped together, savings, small loans, the occasional help from an anonymous investor, into strategies that might never return a profit. I could have lost everything. I might have destroyed relationships beyond repair. Every email I sent, every check I signed felt heavy with consequence. But risk without purpose is recklessness, risk with a plan is power. I moved deliberately. Where some buyers might have demanded immediate collection, I structured options that gave breathing room, payment plans, temporary forbearance, realistic restructuring. My goal was never to ruin them financially. I wanted leverage, enough to make them rethink the casual cruelty of their former voices. I wanted to shift the power dynamic without becoming the monster they had been. At first, like a cold draft under a closed door, unease spread. Phone calls grew shorter. Invitations to small gatherings tapered off. People who had once boasted about stability began to speak in guarded tones about tight months and unexpected expenses. The cousin with the shop started avoiding noon visits. He worked behind closed curtains, eyes flicking to the lock on the door as if expecting a knock. The relative with the car loan tightened every budget line and stopped taking luxuries for granted. My father, who had once hosted loud debates, now asked fewer pointed questions when money came up. Tension is a subtle thing. It doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Often it settles like fog, quiet, dampening, and persistent. The family's perceived security, their bluster, their public posture of ease, those were all illusions. Each paper I held was a small incision into that illusion, and every incision left its mark. There were nights when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. I replayed their faces when they'd laughed, faces that had once felt like home, and tried to reconcile the person I was becoming with the person I had been. The ledger was a blunt instrument, but my heart was not. I knew that once leverage existed, I could either squeeze until something snapped, or I could use it to teach, to correct, to rebuild. So I stayed measured. When a mortgage payment was late, I called with options instead of demands. When a business loan went delinquent, I proposed sensible restructuring rather than immediate foreclosure. In private, I set aside time to help them understand budgets and cash flow as if I were counseling a client, not exacting revenge. The irony was that in acting responsibly, I found a new kind of authority, one rooted in competence instead of humiliation. Word filtered through the family like a rumor. Small confessions reached my ears. "He's buying notes now," someone whispered at a market stall. "Don't make any jokes around him," a neighbor advised. The people who once joked now measured their words. Their laughter had been replaced by calculation. And still, I never revealed my full hand. I did not announce the holdings, nor did I paraded the contracts across the dinner table. The power of what I'd done was not in dramatic confrontation, but in the slow, undeniable shift in how decisions were made at family gatherings. Choices that had been taken for granted were now considered. Pride, which had once been their armor, became a liability they could not afford. By the time I had something substantial, multiple notes, partial mortgages, a portfolio that moved me from invisible to influential, the family's conversations about who's doing well had changed tone. They measured their words, they measured their spending, they measured me. And somewhere between the quiet accumulation and the first polite notices, I understood that leverage was only powerful if you were willing to use it. The question then became not whether I could, but when and how. The next step would be the hardest, the confrontation. I had built a position that demanded a reckoning, and the reckoning would require a calm I wasn't sure I still had. But I also knew this. When I finally spoke, I needed the facts, the papers, and the steadiness of a person who had chosen dignity over spectacle. The day I had been preparing for arrived without fanfare. No fireworks, no grand announcement, just a quiet evening when the family gathered around the same kitchen table where so many insults had once been hurled my way. The air was tense, heavy with something unspoken, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. I sat down at the head of the table this time, a small detail maybe, but one that didn't go unnoticed. My father looked at me with a frown as if trying to decide whether to correct my choice of seat. My cousin smirked nervously, tapping his fingers on the wood. My aunt crossed her arms, already bracing for whatever she thought I had come to say. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. "Do you remember," I began slowly, "the night you all told me I'd never be anything, that I should sit in the corner and keep quiet?" My cousin rolled his eyes. "We were joking, don't tell me you're still holding on to that." I slid the first folder across the table. Inside was his business loan, statements, contracts, every payment he'd missed. His smirk faltered as he flipped through the pages. "Joking," I said quietly, "because the bank didn't think it was a joke when they sold me your loan." He froze, color draining from his face. "You what? No, that's not possible." I leaned back calm. "Numbers don't lie, your shop, your debt, it's mine now. You don't owe the bank anymore, you owe me." The room went silent. My aunt leaned forward, trying to laugh it off. "You're bluffing, you don't have the kind of money to do that." I slid another folder toward her. This one contained the overdue mortgage tied to her name. Her laughter stopped mid-breath. Her hands shook slightly as she skimmed the papers. This is," she stammered, searching for the right words, but the contracts were undeniable. Her arrogance evaporated in real time. Finally, my father spoke, his voice sharp and full of the authority he'd always carried. "Enough of this nonsense. You think you can scare us with paperwork? You're still the same boy who begged me for bus fare." Without a word, I placed the last folder directly in front of him. His mortgage, his overdue balances, the notices of transfer, each stamped, signed, and sealed. He opened it, his hands slower than before, his face tightening with every page. When he reached the end, his jaw clenched. The man who once commanded the room now sat speechless, the truth undeniable before him. "You," he whispered finally, his voice low, "you own this." I nodded, "Yes, all of it. The loans, the cars, the mortgage, piece by piece. While you mocked me, I became the creditor you never saw coming." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My cousin shoved back his chair, his voice rising in anger. "This is insane, you can't do this to family." I looked at him steadily. "Family? When you laughed at me, belittled me in front of strangers, was that family? When you mocked my dreams while taking money I quietly gave, was that family?" My aunt snapped, "We were only teasing. You're twisting it into something it was." I shook my head. "No, you told me to sit in the corner and I listened. But while I sat there I learned, while you laughed I worked, and now here we are." My father slammed a hand on the table. "What do you want from us? To humiliate us? To drag us through the dirt?" For the first time I allowed a small smile. "No, I don't need to humiliate you. The numbers already did that. All I want is acknowledgement that the person you dismissed, the dreamer you mocked, the son you told to stay at the bottom, is the one keeping this house from collapsing." They raged, they denied, they pleaded. My cousin begged for terms, my aunt accused me of betrayal, my father alternated between fury and shame, but I never raised my voice. I simply laid out proof, contracts, statements, timelines. Every page was a mirror they couldn't look away from. By the time the stack of folders was finished, the power dynamic had shifted completely. The people who once dismissed me as irrelevant now sat dependent on my mercy. Their dominance had crumbled into dependency, and they knew it. I looked around the table one last time. Their eyes avoided mine now, darting anywhere but toward the person they had once mocked without hesitation. "This is the truth," I said quietly. And it's not going away. You can keep pretending or you can face it. Either way, the papers don't lie. For the first time in years, they had nothing to say. The ripple effect was faster than I could have imagined. What started at the kitchen table didn't stay there. Word traveled through the family like wildfire, each retelling adding weight and disbelief to the story. By the next day, whispers had become conversations. By the weekend, the wider community had taken notice. Neighbors who had once laughed at me in passing began to watch differently. The cousin who had mocked my ambitions at family gatherings found himself cornered by polite questions. "Are you managing that shop okay? Heard someone else owns your loan now." Their eyes betrayed their discomfort. The ones who had felt secure in their arrogance now faced scrutiny they hadn't anticipated. And yet, I never sent a single announcement. I never posted online, never called a meeting to gloat. The truth moved on its own, and that was all the vindication I needed. At family events, conversations shifted. The once confident voices were quieter. The people who had laughed openly at my dreams now measured their words carefully, their casual remarks tempered by the knowledge that I controlled what they had once taken for granted. Pride, which had been their shield, had become a vulnerability. I began receiving subtle messages of acknowledgement, an aunt quietly thanking me for understanding payment plans, a cousin acknowledging my competence when speaking about finances, even my father offering a tentative nod of respect during a brief encounter. It wasn't exuberant or effusive, but it was real. The contrast was stark. Before, I was the family's joke, the one who sat silently in corners, dismissed and underestimated. Now, quietly and legally, the ledger had shifted. My patience, discretion, and strategic action had transformed the public narrative. They were no longer untouchable figures, their facade of security had cracked. At the same time, I felt a surprising sense of calm. The shift in power was evident, yet I never let pride take the wheel. I didn't gloat, I didn't make a spectacle. That would have been petty. My goal had never been to humiliate them further. Instead, I let the truth speak for itself. Let the facts, the contracts, the debt transfers, the careful execution of strategy stand on their own. And the community saw it. People who had once seen me as a failure now gave hesitant nods of respect. Teachers, neighbors, local shopkeepers, and even distant relatives who had never interacted with me closely began to recognize that the boy who had been laughed at had turned circumstances into a position of authority. The irony was delicious, though I didn't allow it to become mockery. Respect was far more satisfying than revenge. Even in casual conversations, I noticed the difference. Where laughter had filled the room before, there was now a measured tone, a quiet acknowledgement that I was someone to be taken seriously. The family, for all its prior confidence, had been humbled, not by drama or confrontation alone, but by a methodical and patient strategy they had never foreseen. And as I walked through the streets of our neighborhood, people looked at me differently, not with pity, not with the dismissive amusement I had grown used to, but with recognition. It wasn't universal admiration, it wasn't even love. It was something subtler, something earned, reluctant respect. It was a public reckoning born not from noise or anger, but from quiet action. The contrast was undeniable. The same voices that once mocked, ridiculed, and judged now confronted the weight of reality. And I stood in the center of it, calm, composed, letting the ledger tell the story while the laughter and ridicule faded into memory. Through it all, I realized that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones that don't need celebration. The truth, executed patiently and wisely, carries its own weight. And for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, not just because I had proved them wrong, but because I had done so without compromising who I was or what I believed in. By the time the initial shock had worn off, I realized something important. True power isn't measured by how much you can punish someone. It's measured by how wisely you use your leverage. I could have demanded immediate repayment, pushed for penalties, or made examples out of my family. That path would have been satisfying in the short term, but it would have left bitterness, resentment, and broken bonds. Instead, I chose fairness. I restructured debts thoughtfully, offering manageable payment plans, realistic timelines, and options that allowed them to recover without ruin. I ensured every step was clear, professional, and humane. In doing so, I maintained not just my financial control, but also my dignity. I proved that strength doesn't require cruelty. But I didn't stop there. The experience had taught me more than just business strategy. It had revealed how often people fail simply because they lack financial education. I wanted to prevent others from experiencing the same blind spots that had trapped my family. So I launched a small local initiative to teach financial literacy, budgeting, understanding loans, and planning for the future. It wasn't about preaching. It was about empowering people to take control of their own lives before circumstances forced them to. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same house where laughter had once humiliated me became a quiet center of learning. Friends and neighbors who had once doubted my ambitions now sought guidance. My family, once arrogant in their perceived security, began to see the value in knowledge, patience, and careful planning. The contrast was striking. Where once a cycle of humiliation and ridicule had reigned, there was now a cycle of renewal. Revenge could have left scars, but instead, growth replaced anger. My journey hadn't ended in retaliation, it had ended in empowerment, both for me and for those around me. And in that choice I found the most satisfying victory of all. The ability to rise above cruelty, reclaim dignity, and turn a story of mockery into one of lasting respect and positive change. Looking back, the journey feels almost surreal. I was mocked, doubted, and dismissed. I sat quietly in the corners of my own home while their laughter filled the room. I carried the weight of years of sacrifice, of loyalty that was overlooked, and of dreams that were ridiculed in public. Yet through patience, strategy, and careful action, I found vindication, not loud, not boastful, but undeniable. The numbers spoke for themselves. The ledger told the story my words never could. I didn't need applause, I didn't need to gloat. My family's silence, their unease, and their eventual respect were enough. But reflection brings more than satisfaction. It raises a question that lingers beyond numbers, contracts, and debt. What would you have done in my place? Would you have sought revenge, carefully calculating every move until balance was restored? Or would you have walked away, letting pride and humiliation dissolve in silence? Would forgiveness have been possible or even desirable after the years of mockery and betrayal? I ask this not to judge but to invite thought. Each choice carries consequences. Walking away might have preserved some relationships but left injustice unaddressed. Acting decisively might restore dignity but risks alienating those you love. Forgiveness can be powerful, but it requires strength to reconcile humiliation with acceptance. The contrast is clear. I chose restraint over rage, calculation over impulse. I acted not out of hatred, but out of the desire to reclaim my dignity and assert control in a lawful, ethical way. And yet, each of you watching this video carries your own definition of right and wrong. So I leave you with this moral debate. If you were in my place, would you forgive or walk away, and why? Take a moment and think. Consider your own life, your own family, your own choices. And when you've decided, share your answer. Comment below. I genuinely want to know how people reconcile loyalty, respect, and self-worth in the face of betrayal. Before you go, if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these remind us that life doesn't always follow the script we expect. But resilience, patience, and careful choices can turn the most humiliating experiences into triumphs. Remember, being underestimated isn't the end. It's often the beginning of the story you're meant to write yourself. And the most satisfying victories are the ones that leave dignity intact for yourself and even for those who doubted you.